you have been writing a lot recently about like this concept of vaccine apartheid. Do you want to just explain for folks who maybe don't know what that means? I think we all kind of know what that means, but when people hear that, what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the most important questions of our time. So vaccine apartheid refers to the incredibly unequal global distribution of who gets vaccines and who doesn't. So in the entire continent of Africa, roughly 10% of people on average have had the vaccine. That compares with 64% of North America. This is not accidental. This is not some inevitable force of nature. This is the result of global systems that were in large part set up to protect the profits of pharmaceutical companies and set up by those companies. So in October 2020, South Africa and India brought forward a proposal to the World Trade Organization arguing that we should temporarily suspend patent rules to enable access to cheaper generic versions of vaccines. That's a very modest proposal. I think that there's a good case for, given how horrible companies have been, to expropriate them, take them over, redistribute what they have forcibly. But this was just calling for a temporary suspension of patent rules that were actually set up in the WTO in the mid-90s, with Pfizer playing a huge role in lobbying for the protection of patents.
And they asked for that in March of this year. So
they asked for that in October 2020 was when the proposal was first put forward.
Oh, so, okay. So even earlier than the vaccine rollout started.
Yeah. So they saw what was coming and rightfully predicted that the vaccine would be very unequally distributed. Also, South Africa and India have huge pharmaceutical sectors and have the domestic ability to produce mRNA vaccines, the kinds of vaccine that Pfizer is putting out, for example. So that proposal was put forward in October 2020. It had the support of more than 100 countries, or it now has the support of more than 100 countries, major human rights organizations. It's a total no-brainer. And yet it has stalled out. There is no progress, or very little progress, rather. The European Union is playing probably the biggest role in blocking it. Also the United Kingdom. And then the Biden administration is doing something really sneaky where it is saying that it supports a patent waiver of some kind, but it's being very unspecific and vague and not clarifying whether it supports the specific patent waiver put forward by India and South Africa. And if it doesn't support that waiver, then what is it requesting? What changes does it want? All this is very unclear. In effect, what that is doing is blocking progress, when in fact the Biden administration, if it really believes in a patent waiver, should support the proposal as is. It's the only proposal on the table that actually calls for a suspension of patent rules. And it should also be forcing the EU, for example, to stop blocking progress.
Okay, well, yeah, let's talk about Biden in a second. You said a lot there, but so I want to understand, in this entire time since the vaccine rollout, Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, there's not been movement. There has not been any access to those patents, those mRNA patents. I know J&J is not mRNA, but in this entire year, there's not been movement.
Yeah, so you're right. There has been no movement in suspending patent rules under the TRIPS agreement. So the TRIPS agreement is a WTO agreement that basically protects pharmaceutical monopolies with some limited exceptions. And so in May of this year, the Biden administration made a big announcement saying that it was going to reverse the Trump administration's policy of blocking that proposal. And it was a big announcement. It grabbed headlines. The headlines, were to the tune of Biden supports the patent waiver. And a lot of activists who work really hard on that issue and hadn't seen a lot of progress were very hopeful and very excited. And they said that was progress. But in actuality, there's been a really big gulf between what the Biden administration has been saying on the political level and then what it's actually been doing behind closed doors at the TRIPS Council meetings, most of which are closed off to journalists and closed off to the public. But when, there are reports from anonymous trade diplomats, and I I recently got my hands on just a write-up of the proceedings from Geneva trade diplomats. And if you look at the actual write-up, at the most recent one, after the Omicron variant was already scaring people around the world, and after the Biden administration recently, on I think November 26th, got headlines for saying that he was going to double down on supporting patent waivers. At the very next TRIPS Council meeting after that, all the Biden administration did was refer back to the previous comments that it had made publicly. And that's not how progress at the WTO actually works. The way, the US is very powerful at the WTO, and if it wants something to happen, it can make it happen. And when you talk to activists who are working on this issue, people from Third World Network, people from groups like Public Citizens Access to Medicines Program, they will tell you that they're so incredibly frustrated and that they feel like the Biden administration is foot dragging and not genuinely going to bat for this issue. So I guess, to answer your question, there was some hope that there had been progress in May with the announcement, but it looks like the cheerleading that happened might have been a tad premature.
Insane. I mean, and I think the one thing I'm still getting my head around is that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, not the World Health Organization, here's my family coming in, that they're the ones who are making this call versus health organizers, like that it's more an issue of trade than it is about health. The World Health Organization's been asking for patent waivers to be dropped, or for patent waivers, since the beginning of the vaccine development. And yet when it comes to a global pandemic, we're looking at the money side 100% on this.
Yeah. How much money do we really need? Like, how much money do you like people are so greedy.
You got to pay rent in hell. What the fuck, man?
You can't take it with you.
Exactly. And so right. So that's where we go to the World Trade Organization. So you're basically saying Biden's like, yeah, we want in theory to waive the patents. Anyway, we said that a few months ago. Doopy doo. It'll happen. Maybe. I don't care.
Right.
Like, so it's just, it's all talk, and they're not actually putting pressure on anybody. Can you talk about why that is and what the arrangement has been between some of these big pharma companies and not just Biden, but the former administration as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I look at sort of why this is and why this global system exists, one of the things that I always think about was the global justice movement of the late 90s and early 2000s. The people who shut down the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999, and how prescient that movement was, because, we talk about patents and intellectual property as though they're so-called like natural, just the natural state of things and natural order. Things like piracy are bad. We just know that they're bad. But in reality, before the TRIPS agreement in the late 90s, there wasn't one set agreed upon rule of what intellectual property rules even are. And the creation of the world order as it currently exists is relatively recent. And what the TRIPS agreement essentially did was press the entire world to conform to the US understanding of what intellectual property rules are. And, it wasn't some like organic, happy, harmonious process. It was largely the product of pharmaceutical companies whose profits depend on protecting intellectual properties, doing incredible lobbying, not just in the US, but also across Europe, also in places like Japan. And so that's just the baseline. The baseline is this idea that pharmaceutical monopolies matter more than people's lives. That has wreaked havoc.
And they're writing international trade law. They've been writing international trade laws, and it's like kind of, I mean, this is why we can't have nice things and or access to affordable medicine.
Yeah, because of greed. It's all greed.
And think about what was happening in the mid 90s when the TRIPS Council, the TRIPS agreement was established. That was like during a really bad stretch of the global AIDS pandemic, HIV/AIDS pandemic, and so I think a lot of people who are paying attention to how those intellectual property rules affected access to HIV and AIDS medications and treatments were really concerned that something similar and horrible would play out when it came to the pandemic. And, the pharmaceutical industry is very powerful. It has huge lobbying arms. It's a huge funder of both Democrats and Republicans. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't hide its lobbying. It's very forthright. Like, you can look at the press releases put out by, like trade organizations that represent Pfizer and companies like that. And they're just very explicit. They say things like, we need to protect intellectual property. So one of their biggest arguments actually has been a TRIPS waiver won't even matter anyways, because the global south doesn't have the ability to produce mRNA vaccines. So it's totally
fun.
And that is a very racist argument. It's basically saying like, oh, no. You're not sophisticated enough. Just rely on your former colonizers. We've got this covered. You don't have the ability to do it. However, that's actually totally false. There are plenty of places, Indonesia, South Africa, India, Thailand, Argentina. There are plenty of global south countries that have facilities that could start producing mRNA vaccines right now. There was a big New York Times investigation about that recently. And so, the industry is both doing this outright spin and then is also creating a climate of fear and intimidation. There are a lot of Latin American countries like Colombia, for example, where there's a ton of fear that if they move too quickly or too strongly to support the TRIPS waiver at the WTO or to support compulsory licensing domestically, or even just ask for more transparency, they're afraid that companies will actually withhold supply. There's a lot of fear around
withhold
that.
supply, like if that they're afraid that if they overturn the TRIPS waiver, that then pharma companies will be like, okay, well, I guess we just ran out. Oh, we'd love to help.
Because the pharmaceutical companies have all the power, and there are countries that are desperate and people are dying, and global distribution is really unequal. There was actually an incident in Colombia relatively recently where an anti-corruption lawyer, this guy Camilo Enciso, he published some of the Colombia's contracts with pharmaceutical companies. Just publish a contract, that's it. And there was like a government meltdown, and there were all of these officials, high up officials, all the way to the president, who said that they were concerned that just that act of, quote, unauthorized disclosure of a contract might lead to horrible ramifications, the implication being that supply might be withheld. And, it's not, even if that's not actually going to happen, just the idea that that level of intimidation exists shows the extent to which pharmaceutical companies have the upper hand. And these are companies who, by definition, by law, are only accountable to their shareholders. They're not allowed legally to be accountable to anyone else. Yet they have the lives of people all over the world in their hands.
I mean, it is interesting and important to, there's part of me that's like, yeah, of course, Biden, he's probably got, pharma executives, and former pharma executives in his cabinet, which I think he might. I can't remember all of them, but it is so easy to rely on like, oh, the WTO and the TRIPS clause or whatever. Guess we can't. We should, but we can't. And it sort of provides this cover for keeping pharma happy and making sure you can still fundraise off of them. As we know, there's like what's the ratio of like pharma lobbyists to Congress people? It's like 30-1 or something floating around DC or something disgusting like that.
I don't know the exact number, but it's pretty bad.
It's something silly. But so I wanted to show, because Sarah, you're mentioning how many other countries can produce vaccines. This is from, very big lefty New York Times reporting. And they basically did an independent investigation into different pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities around the world. And exactly all the countries that you're mentioning: Indonesia, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, India, and naming the exact companies that could produce mRNA vaccines. If only there was a patent lift. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.